The reading today is from Isaiah chapter 49, verses 1 through 7. Listen to me, O coastlands. Pay attention, you people from far away. The Lord called me before I was born. While I was in my mother's womb, he named me. He made my mouth like a sharp sword. In the shadows of his hand, he hid me. He made me a polished arrow. In his quiver, he hid me away. He said to me, "You are my servant, Israel, in whom I will be glorified." But I said, "I have labored in vain. I have spent my strength for nothing and vanity. Yet surely my cause is with the Lord, and my reward with my God." And now the Lord says, "Who formed me in the womb to be his servant, to bring Jacob back to him, and that Israel might be gathered to him, for I am honored in the sight of the Lord, and my God has become my strength." He says, "It is too light a thing that you should be my servant, to rise up the tribes of Jacob and to restore the survivors of Israel. I will give you as a light to the nations, that my salvation may reach to the end of the earth. Thus said the Lord, the Redeemer of Israel and his Holy One, to one deeply despised, abhorred by the nations, the slave of rulers. Kings shall see and stand up, princes, and they shall prostrate themselves, because of the Lord who is faithful, the Holy One of Israel, who has chosen you."
Nobody ever said that following Jesus would be easy. Although, didn't Jesus say something in Matthew 11:30 like his yoke was easy and his burden was light? Yeah, he did say that. But when you look at the verse in context, you realize that he only seems to offer this easy burden to those who are weary and heavy laden. Over in Matthew 16, Jesus teaches his disciples, though, that if they want to follow him, thus they must deny themselves and take up a cross. Okay, so which is it? Is it easy or is it hard, right? I spent a good number of my years in ministry working for the regional expression of the church. And to give you a little recap, I kind of gave you a little recap here in announcements. We as a denomination are kind of split up into three different manifestations or expressions. We've got the local church, which is our congregation right here, First Christian Church, and First Christian in Paradise, and First Christian in Redding and Corning, and so on and so forth. That's congregational. And then there is the regional manifestation of the church, the regional expression, and that's all of the Christian Church Disciples of Christ congregations in Northern California and Nevada. And then there is the general manifestation of the church, and that's all of the churches in the U.S. and in Canada and all of our global mission partners. So, I worked for the regional aspect of the church. I worked two regions. One as a part-time minister of search and call here in the Northern California and Nevada region, and for 9 years as the associate regional minister in Virginia. And one of my responsibilities in Virginia was providing staff support to the region's clergy committee, which included the care and nurture of those who were active in vocational ministry and those who were preparing to go into vocational ministry. These were usually seminary students who were working towards a career in ministry. And for the most part, it was a very satisfying and uplifting committee to work with. But there was a shadow side too, because sometimes it was very discouraging to learn just how many people who go into the ministry don't really stay there. In fact, the other night, Mary and I were talking about the graduating class of 1989 of Northwest Christian College. It was college, and there was two tracks. There was L track and M track, and we were in the M track, people who were going into the ministry. And we started thinking about how many people who were in the M track are still in ministry, and we could only think of a handful. And thank goodness, because I thought, no way. So I called Corinne, who was the registrar up at Northwest Christian College, and she sent me a spreadsheet of those people. And Mary, we were right. There are very few of us that are still in ministry. You know, I've worked with the care and nurture committees both in Virginia and here. And it really seems like only half of the people who are in seminary who want to go into ministry actually stay in ministry. A lot of the folks who we worked with on the clergy committee told us that vocational ministry is sort of like banging your head against a brick wall because you were always doing damage to your most important equipment, but the thing that you're trying to have an impact on, the thing that you're trying to either move or remodel, doesn't move at all. So, with that, others compare it to plate spinners. Now, have you ever seen a plate spinner? You could see them in circuses or in old vaudeville shows. And the plate spinners are kind of like jugglers, except for they have a different task. Their task is to take a plate and spin it on a bamboo pole and have the bamboo pole standing up, and then they keep these plates spinning on these bamboo poles. It's doable. You can do it. But what happens is you have to keep on top of things, or else the plates are going to start crashing. And then things fall apart really quick when more plates are added. And things get disastrous when you're not the one who's adding the plates. So that's how some people see this ministry thing. I remember one pastor in training who wrote a reflection paper. All of the people in the committee were supposed to write reflection papers on their ministerial experience. And one, she got all poetic. And she wrote, "I find that I love my enemy, but they still do not change. I give to the poor, but there are still more poor. I seek to change my behavior, and yet another destructive one emerges. I strive to make a difference, but there is none. I feel like a failure." Now, the cool thing is she stayed in ministry because she learned to live with those feelings. She learned to admit those feelings. And I have to say, she's quite successful now. Now, clergy aside, I think that we've all felt that way at some level, regardless of our vocation, especially those who work in careers or vocations that involve guiding people through a transformational process that requires people to change. So teachers, social workers, counselors, medical professionals, public health workers, and yes, vocational ministers too. These are not jobs. In fact, these are not even careers. These are vocations. And the very word vocation means a call, to call. And so you got to have a servant's heart to follow that call, and you've got to be willing to do the hard work, the self-reflection, the self-care, and have the necessary healthy boundaries in order to succeed in that calling. So our passage from Isaiah today is about a prophet whose vocation or calling is to serve. In fact, the section that Gary read is often called the servant, or the servant's mission, or the servant's song. Now, the servant in this passage is one who was chosen and called before birth. God formed this servant for the job of bringing Israel back to their Creator. And He gave the servant a mouth that is sharp and words that are pointed, like a sword or an arrowhead, or as some translations say, a scalpel. And it's kind of funny because we sometimes talk about someone who wounds with their words as being blunt. And yet here in this passage, Isaiah uses the imagery of being too sharp. The servant's words cut. The impact of their words made the people turn against the servant because the people were stubborn and they were resistant to the servant's words. And the result was that not only did the servant fail to make much of an impact on people's behaviors, he got into big trouble himself. The impact of his words did not fall on the people who he was to minister to. The result was that not only did he fail to make an impact on others' behavior, he got into trouble. He got kicked around. He was despised. The description of this person is classic burnout. I'm spent, I've labored in vain, and for no purpose. Now comes the hard part. This is where I have to pause and ask, what on earth was God thinking? Because in response to this poor, weary, beat-up person who has not seen any positive results for his efforts, God tells him that his job wasn't really that hard. And now he has to step up to the plate and do something even bigger. He has to fulfill his calling in even a bigger way. You know, so much for Israel. Let's go global with this thing. Let's move on to the rest of the world. Let's go for it. The task was just too small, you poor, beaten up, sad sack. Let's make you go on out and do something even more difficult. You know, what kind of a God is this? Is God cruel? Is God a taskmaster that takes away somebody's tool and then expects him to produce twice as much? You know? Does God not have an accurate understanding of what's even going on here? Does God just think that this prophet's a whiner who needs to be pushed harder to find out where his inner resources are? If you turn a blind eye to the hope that's in this text, then yes, God could be any of those things. But that's not the case. This weary, despised, depleted servant proclaims that God is his strength, and he will trust God's assessment of the situation. God is his maker, the one who wired him for the task. God knows his strengths and deficits and knows the servant is at the breaking point. By all worldly standards, the servant is a failure. But there's no dent in the brick wall. But God sees the effort and doesn't count it as a failure. This episode was only part of the vision, and all is not lost. And the beauty about the partnership between God and this servant is that it is not the servant who has to stand on his own. The servant doesn't have to look strong and brave and indestructible. See, it's God's glory that shines through the servant that makes a difference. Let me tell you about a flaw that I see in the superhero genre. Oh my gosh, Jesse sees a flaw. Yes, there is a flaw in the superhero genre, and we see it in the comic books, we see it in the movies and everything like that. The flaw is that the hero doesn't have to do everything themselves, because that's the way it is in, like Superman. Let's take, for example, Superman, the one who stands alone to fight for truth, justice, and the American way. Superman is faster than a speeding bullet. He's more powerful than a locomotive. He's able to leap tall buildings with a single bound. But notice in the comics and in the movies, Even after doing all those heroic things, he still manages to look shiny and handsome. And at the very end of the battle, he achieves everything, and he is still standing. But Superman's not real. This servant is real. Dirty, disheveled, human, finite. The servant struggles to achieve his objective, but God's glory manages to shine through. The servant is spent, has no strength, but God's strength is the power that sustains him. Now, if the whole task was up to the servant alone, then yeah, we definitely have reason to despair. But it is God who was initiating this work before the servant was even born. It is God who is calling the people back. It is God who is the very salvation for the whole world. The work is God's. We are the ones who, by the power of God's Spirit, are invited to join in this work as we are created to do. We are not supermen or superwomen, though. We're not out here valiantly trying to save the world. We are humble servants who are strengthened and empowered by God's Holy Spirit to enter into God's redeeming work in the world. I can't help but feel that as we struggle with the task of being God's people, it helps to know this. As we swing into a new year and gear up for what awaits us, some of us are hoping that it's going to be far less bonkers than the year before that, or the year before that. I heard someone the other day say that January 1st, 2023 is day 730 of the year 2020. As we look around and see the people that surround us, our friends, our family members, our coworkers, and contemplate how we are to be good news to them. As we look at the floods and landslides that have devastated the West Coast, and we look at the tornadoes that have ripped through the southeast this past week, as we consider the ongoing devastation of the war in Ukraine and wonder how in the world these communities and countries can be rebuilt and what we can do, as we see the divisiveness in our own country, as we see the direction it's taking and wonder how in the world can we make our voices count and influence the decision makers. It helps to know that it is God who restores. It is God who strengthens. It is God who forms us for the task. It is the servant Christ who was spent and despised and labored for no obvious gain until being raised to be the light that shines for the whole world, who walks this journey with us. It is the Spirit who breathes life, fires us up, and gives us visions and dreams of great things. The Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., whose life we celebrate tomorrow, once said, "Everybody can be great because anyone can serve." You don't have to have a college degree to serve. You don't have to make your subject and verb agree to serve. You need only a heart full of grace, a soul generated by love. May God provide us with food for the journey and grace for the road as we pick up and set off again this year proclaiming the truth that we know.